Wall Street's water war. Why your next bill spike isn't about drought. The taps die mid-dinner. Air hisses, then silence. A push alert hits every phone in this booming suburb. Emergency. Pump cutoff in 48 hours. Group chats explode. Someone says a valve failed. Someone else swears it's the drought. Then a rumor lands like a brick. New owners. They shut us off. Here's the twist. This isn't a weather story. It's a balance sheet story. Somewhere, a spreadsheet decided water should be worth more tomorrow if it hurts today. And a clause you've never heard of is about to cost this town millions. To see how we got here, we need to rewind. Rewind. The moment water became an asset class. Start with a simple rule. Use it or lose it. Western water law grew up around scarcity. Rivers that run small most years, then roar some years. Prior appropriation turned water into a queue, first in line, first in right. Senior users get theirs, junior users get what's left. It kept mines and canals running in the 180s. It also baked in a pecking order that finance could underwrite. Meanwhile, in the late 20th century, a different idea took root. Everything essential could be improved by the market. Electricity unbundled. Telecom privatized. Cities cash-strapped by tax limits started eyeing their pipes. Pension funds flushed with contributions needed stable, inflation-linked cash flows. Infrastructure became the new darling, boring, necessary, toll-like. Water fit the checklist: predictable demand, monopoly service, regulators who prefer no surprises. Here's where the legal plumbing matters. In many Western states, groundwater rights can be separated from the land. You can own a right to pump, even if you don't farm. Over time, adjudicated basins turned messy local customs into ledgers. How much, how often, under what conditions? Once it's on a ledger, you can lease it. You can option it. You can pledge it as collateral. Rights become entitlements, and entitlements become revenue streams. Scarcity wasn't a bug. It was the premium. Climate volatility sharpened the price signal. Drier years meant water was more valuable. In finance, volatility plus scarcity equals an asset you can model. You can build scenarios, stress test flows, tie debt service to indexed rates. If the regulator lets you hike prices with inflation, or better yet, with cost pass-throughs, your cash flows look durable. Durable cash flows attract cheap debt. Cheap debt lets you buy more rights. The flywheel starts. To understand how the flywheel gains speed, think about the players. Private equity liked roll-ups. Lots of small systems, fragmented basins, little bargaining power. Infrastructure funds like 30-year concessions with guaranteed returns. Pensions wanted inflation hedges. Sovereign wealth funds wanted assets nobody would shut down. Everyone preferred places where the legal regime was mature enough to trade, but messy enough to arbitrate. That gap between law on paper and water in a pipe wasn't a deterrent. It was the spread. The 199s and 200s set the stage. Utilities modernized their language. Service performance agreements, availability payments, take or pay. Cities, told to stay lean, outsourced operations and financing. The pitch was consistent. Private money would fund upgrades the public couldn't. The reality tucked in the appendices. Ratepayers backstopped the upgrades, plus returns, plus fees, for decades. Meanwhile, another quiet shift made trading easier. Water banks and exchanges sprang up, some public, some private. If you could move water, or the right to receive water, from one user to another, you could arbitrage time and need. An almond farmer could lease a year's allocation to a city in a drought and buy it back in a wet year. A utility could prepay for carryover water to store in a reservoir or underground basin. Brokers emerged. Consultants priced deals. A market coalesced. Then finance did what finance always does. It standardized the story. Benchmarks and indices arrived. If you can point to a price history, you can sell a hedge. If you can sell a hedge, you can justify leverage. The pitch decks wrote themselves. Non-correlated real asset with inflation protection and regulatory underpinning. Investors nodded. Residents didn't see the slide that said, rate increases subject to approval. The keystone sentence that effectively moved political risk onto local councils with bond rating anxiety. What nobody accounted for, at least honestly, was the political physics of telling people their water bill just doubled. Or that paper water doesn't always line up with wet water. Return flows, environmental floors, downstream rights. All the stuff that makes actual rivers work don't neatly reconcile with a spreadsheet. In dry years, the gap becomes visible. That's when the clauses matter. Here's the clause to remember. Carryover lets a rights holder bank unused water into the next year. In a scarce system, banking isn't neutral. It withholds supply from the spot market, pushing up prices in the present while improving bargaining power later. Add no substitution language, no using alternate sources to meet an obligation, and you've got a forced buyer if a city's main allocation collapses. Add take or pay. Pay even if undelivered, and suddenly shortages become revenue certainty for the seller and a fiscal emergency for the buyer. Layer in interest rates. For a decade, debt was cheap. Deals penciled because the discount rate made anything look affordable. When rates climbed, every floating rate note tied to a water system repriced. Debt service coverage covenants. Those ratios lenders used to keep you on a short leash, tightened. If usage dipped or drought conservation cut volumes, revenues fell. To avoid a breach, utilities raised rates mid-year. Families cut back more. Revenues fell again. That's the trap. Now step back to the first principles. Law created a hierarchy of rights to ration scarcity. Finance converted those rights into tradable entitlements and collateral. Privatization invited leveraged buyers to lock in returns through contracts that shift risk to the public. Climate variability juiced the scarcity premium, making hedges and storage more valuable. Each layer made sense on its own terms. Together, they turned water, the thing that makes a town livable, into a balance sheet contest. And this is why a suburb can get a 48-hour cutoff notice with no drought in the forecast. The system wasn't built to fail. It was built to pay. The question is, to whom and under what conditions? Keep that in mind as we walk into the acquisition machine that learned how to buy the taps before anyone noticed. The acquisition engine. Who's buying what and why? While the neighborhood argued about valves and droughts, something else was happening in conference rooms with no windows. The money was mapping the basin like a chessboard. Not just buying utilities, buying the inputs that utilities would need when the math got tight. Start with the roster. Private equity hunts for roll-ups. Dozens of tiny mutual water companies, HOA systems, small-town districts with part-time operators and rusty meters. Fragmentation means weak negotiation. Stitch them together, standardize billing, centralize procurement, and suddenly you've got pricing power where there used to be baked sales. Infrastructure funds show up with a different posture. They're patient capital on paper. They want 25 to 40-year concessions, inflation-linked returns, and contracts the size of a phone book that say recoverable costs a dozen different ways. Think Macquarie, Brookfield, IFM, KKR's infrastructure arms. They'll buy treatment plants, storage reservoirs, and the pipes that move water from point A to point B. They like assets with toll booth logic. Every gallon that passes throws off a fee. Then come pensions and sovereign wealth funds. They don't need headlines, they need duration. The Canadian plans, Dutch funds, Australian supers, Abu Dhabi and Singapore, capital with obligations stretching half a century. For them, water is a hedge against the very inflation that hits benefits. They'll sit in the equity of the infrastructure funds or co-invest on big platforms, happy to let someone else run the asset while they clip index-linked coupons. What are they actually buying? Not just utilities. They're buying pumping rights, priority tickets in the prior appropriation queue. They're buying conveyance shares, capacity on canals and aqueducts that decide whose water moves when. They're buying storage, surface reservoirs, groundwater banking credits, even empty aquifers that can swallow wet year flows and sell them back in dry years. They're buying treatment, membranes, plants, and the O&M contracts that come with periodic upgrades you'll fund through your bill. And yes, they're buying entire utilities when they can, especially in states where fair market value laws let them roll acquisition costs into rates. Roll-ups matter because water is local but finance isn't. In a single basin, dozens of operators create a thicket of rules, fees, and weak bargaining. Consolidate, and you set the reference price. By the operator plus the canal shares plus the storage credits, and you don't just control water, you control timing. In scarcity, timing is money. The fuel is debt. For a decade, low rates made leverage a feature. Deals penciled on floating rate loans, cheap swaps, and covenant packages written in soft voices. The thesis was simple. Index revenues to inflation, bake in cost pass-throughs, and you can carry more debt without breaking a sweat. Then rates jumped. Overnight, that flexible capital got sharp elbows. Debt service coverage ratios. 1.25x, 1.35x, sometimes 1.5x, turned into tripwires. Miss the ratio, and the lender has rights, cash sweeps, restrictions on spending, forced rate petitions. If regulators balk, the equity gets a phone call. Here's a microstory. A regional operator CEO is halfway through breakfast when the lender's relationship manager calls. The term sheet for the revolver renewal just changed. Because volumes dipped during mandatory conservation, DSCR fell to 1.21x, below the 1.25x covenant. The fix: raise rates 12% within the quarter or accept a default waiver fee plus a 300 basis point margin step-up. 12% on families that were told conserve to help the system. The borrower glances at the agenda for that night's city council meeting. Public comment is going to be rough. Debt structure isn't the only pressure point. Equity wants exits. Private equity funds live on 7 to 10-year clocks. Infrastructure funds stretch longer, but still need distributions and occasional realizations. That creates an incentive to juice EBITDA now. Defer maintenance that doesn't show up in the income statement, capitalize what you can, and push a rate case labeled resilience to fund capex that lifts the rate base. The optics are upgrades. The reality is balance sheet engineering. Meanwhile, consolidation can be surgical. In basins with adjudicated rights, investors target junior rights at distressed prices, pair them with storage and weight. In wet years, they bank cheap water. In dry years, carryover clauses tighten the market, and their optionality pays off. Utilities that depend on spot purchases learn a hard lesson. You don't negotiate well when the taps are at risk and your bond rating is on the line. Why do they do it? Because the return stack is layered. Base returns from regulated rates or lease income. Inflation kicker from indexation. Scarcity premium from drought years. Optionality from storage and carryover. Downside protection from take or pay and no substitution clauses. And a soft floor under equity provided by ratepayers who can't switch suppliers. There's also a strategic bet. Climate volatility creates more price events. More events mean more opportunities to monetize flexibility. Shifting deliveries across months, arbitraging basins, selling reliability in a world that is less of it. In that world, who owns the right to move water? Literally the conveyance. Matters as much as who owns the right to pump. So they buy both. Notice what's missing: the people who drink the water. The acquisition memos rarely mention bill shock or council blowback, except as regulatory risk, a line item managed with consultants and community meetings. But those memos do list jurisdictional fragmentation, asymmetric information, and asset-light incumbents as opportunities. Translation: complexity favors whoever can afford lawyers and time. Ownership is step one. Monetization needs markets. Once you've assembled rights, shares, and storage, you need price signals to turn scarcity into revenue and volatility into hedges. That's where the next layer, indices, futures, securitized leases, slides onto the stage. The spreadsheet looks elegant. The pipes don't care. How water rights work, and why it's a legal time bomb. To see how finance gets leverage, we need to stand inside the plumbing of the law. Prior appropriation is simple until it isn't. First in time, first in right means the earliest users, often miners, canal companies, early farmers, hold senior rights. In a shortage, they get served first. Junior rights get cut. On paper, that's orderly. In practice, it's a survival triage that can turn modern suburbs into the last people in line. Now add groundwater. In many Western states, surface water and groundwater live under different rules. Some basins are adjudicated. Everyone's rights are measured, recorded, and ranked. Others are unadjudicated, historical pumping, estimates, and guesswork. In adjudicated basins, you'll see annual safe yield set by a court or a watermaster. Every right gets a percentage allocation each year. If hydrology is bad, the percentage shrinks. If you own storage credits, you can top up. If you don't, you stare at a shorter number and start calling brokers. The split between paper water and wet water starts here. A right is an entitlement to a volume under certain conditions. Wet water is what shows up after losses: seepage, evaporation, return flows, environmental floors. Prior appropriation assumed you'd divert, use, and some portion would return to the system. Irrigation tailwater, treated effluent, seepage back to the river. That return supports downstream users. So the law built a no-injury rule. Transfers can't harm other rights. If you move water from Farm A to City B, you need to protect the people who relied on the return flows from Farm A. On paper, it's handled with modeling, mitigation, and conditions. In dry years, those models blow wide, and what a spreadsheet calls equivalent doesn't feel equivalent to the neighbor whose well just dropped. Meanwhile, in unadjudicated basins, chaos is policy. The doctrine might still be reasonable use, but there's no hard ledger. Pumpers drill deeper, wells race each other to the bottom, and the tragedy gets measured in horsepower as much as acre-feet. When a basin like that finally enters adjudication, everyone lawyered up years ago. You'll see claims inflated to anchor negotiations, historical use reconstructed from dusty ledgers and crop maps, and a court trying to freeze motion long enough to write a constitution. Investors prefer adjudicated basins for certainty, but distressed, unadjudicated ones are fertile ground to buy influence early. Transfers are where this gets financial. There are temporary leases, 1 year, seasonal, even monthly. There are options, pay now for the right to buy later if a trigger hits. There are long-term transfers, permanent severance of a right from one parcel to another use. And there are banks, public or quasi-public entities that hold water in surface reservoirs or groundwater basins and issue credits. Transfers trigger the no-injury test and often a hydrologic study. They also trigger litigation when downstream, users claim the model lied. Return flows are the sleeper. Cities often treat wastewater and send it back to rivers or recharge basins. Farmers flood irrigation supported shallow aquifers for neighbors' wells. When a city buys farm water and pipes it, the return flow pattern changes. Legally, some jurisdictions protect those returns, others don't. If the protection is weak, third-party harm gets socialized. Downstream users and ecosystems eat the shortfall, while the buyer records a successful transfer. Which brings us to the accounting games. In wet years, allocations rise, and everyone looks responsible. In dry years, carryover rules decide who can bank in used water into next year. That sounds like prudent storage. It can also be strategic hoarding. If carryover volumes are large and lightly taxed by evaporation or loss factors, a big holder can sit on water that might otherwise circulate. Prices spike now. The holder sells reliability later. If the holder paired that with no substitution clauses in contracts, meaning the buyer can't satisfy obligations with other sources, then in a shortage, the buyer can be forced to take only that seller's water or pay penalties for not doing so. There's also the paper versus wet mismatch on return expectations. Some contracts treat a unit of entitlement as a unit of delivery minus a fixed loss. But real losses aren't fixed. Heat waves change evaporative losses. Fire ash clogs intakes. Infrastructure failures add unplanned leaks. When the physical world moves and the contract doesn't, the disputes begin. Lawsuits move slowly. Payment clocks don't. Groundwater adjudication adds one more twist: production rights versus storage rights. Production rights let you pump a share of the annual safe yield. Storage rights let you store non-native water, imported or banked wet year surplus, and later extract it. Investors like storage because it's optionality. But storage credits can crowd out the space in an aquifer needed for local recharge. If the basin fills with paper storage, a big storm can push water past capacity and out to sea, while locals are told, "We're full." It's the maddening sentence that makes sense technically and enrages people politically. Finally, the hierarchy itself is a fuse. Senior rights can be attached to crops or communities that no longer exist in the same way. When seniors lease to cities, juniors lose the runoff and timing they counted on. Courts try to police third-party impacts. Politics tries to ignore them until the fish die or the wells cough air. The legal system was built to ration scarcity fairly among users. Finance was built to extract predictability from that scarcity. The time bomb is when contractual predictability collides with hydrologic unpredictability, and the law, meant to adapt slowly, is asked to bend quickly for cash flows. Once rights move like securities and obligations lock like bonds, every clause matters more than the weather forecast. The market can clear, with price. Communities can't always clear, with votes. And that gap is where the next crisis hides, silently compounding in footnotes and side letters, waiting for the river to run low. The pricing stack: indices, futures, and securitized water. Before the debt trap shows up on your bill, price signals teach contracts how to behave. Turn rights into data, then data into benchmarks, and you've built the layer that lets finance hedge scarcity and justify leverage, often with side effects that outpace any drought. Start with the index. Once brokers stitched enough trades into a series, vendors published reference prices for regional water, spot leases, forward allocations, storage premia. The pitch is standard: transparency, efficiency, risk management. In practice, an index becomes a story everyone points at when negotiating. If the line slopes up in June, sellers cite it, buyers eat it. When an index drops after a storm, many deals don't, because contracts have floors and clauses, and indices are advisory until they're embedded in term sheets. Futures followed. Cash-settled contracts let utilities hedge budget risk, and growers hedge input costs without moving a gallon. That can be useful. It can also create basis risk, the difference between your lived reality and the index's model. Your basin's canal fails, the index doesn't notice. Your allocations fall on a legal ruling, the index shrugs. Hedges that didn't map your pain still settle, delivering cash, or taking it at the worst time. Treasurers learn the hard lesson. A hedge that fits the spreadsheet can miss the pipe. Then come options and strips. Orchards buy call options on emergency allocations. Cities buy collars that cap upside on drought years and sell downside in wet years. Sellers package reliability portfolios, blocks of storage and conveyance paired with delivery windows, to behave like utilities without the meters. The premium is labeled resilience. In a crunch, premiums turn into tolls. If the option strike sits below panic prices, exercise crowds the spot market and lifts the baseline for everyone who didn't or couldn't prepay. Securitization adds teeth. Long-term leases on senior rights get bundled, tranched, and sold to investors who like semi-bond-like cash flows with a scarcity kicker. Covenants ride along. Cash sweeps, DSCR, triggers on allocation cuts. Miss a trigger and waterfall rules kick in. Payments to junior tranches pause, reserve accounts lock, and sellers tighten terms to cure. What looked like a sleepy cash stream behaves like structured credit under stress, precisely when a city needs flexibility. Affiliates harvest the gray. A platform owns pieces up and down the stack, rights, storage, conveyance, and a trading arm. The trading arm earns spreads between index-linked terms and local realities. If carryover rules and no substitution clauses tighten your choices, the affiliate doesn't need to manipulate prices to profit. It needs only to be first to see constraints and slowest to ease them. Disclosure rarely forces these books into daylight. Residents see only the bill. Quality adjustments are the quiet wild card. Not all gallons are equal. Turbidity spikes, PFAS limits, salinity creep, treatment costs swing with chemistry. Indices rarely carry full quality premium. Contracts do. A seller offers equivalent water that needs extra treatment. The index suggests one number, your plant logs another. The difference walks right into your rate case as a pass-through. Now connect this to governance. If a council approves hedges without a policy, the utility can end up long premium and short patience. If a regulator allows indexation without transparency, affordability rides a line nobody elected. If a water bank posts balances quarterly, speculation can outrun facts weekly. The fix isn't to ban tools. It's to force them to serve the pipe, not the page. Guardrails are simple: hedgers only in futures, hard position limits, public aggregate positioning by basin. Indices with audited methodologies, quality factors, and conveyance basis adjustments. Public posting of carryover balances, scheduled releases, and affiliate transactions in near real time. Securitizations that scale payments to physical availability and pause when allocations sink, not when lawyers agree later. Contracts that allow substitution and true UPS so options don't become traps. Do this, and price can inform without dictating. Skip it, and the pricing stack becomes a lever that lifts bills faster than reservoirs refill. With that in mind, the next section shows how those price-shaped contracts flow straight into your monthly statement when debt covenants wake up. The utility debt trap: why rates spike even when service falls. The spreadsheet looked tidy until it met the street. Utilities signed privatization contracts that promised efficiency and resilience, then baked in guarantees that turned your bill into a debt service instrument. The words sound harmless: revenue sufficiency, cost recovery, regulatory compact. In practice, they're guardrails for creditors, not cushions for households. Start with the contract skeleton. Concessions and purchase agreements often include guaranteed returns on the rate base. the asset value utilities earn on. Expand the rate base with capital projects, and earnings grow. That's why glossy decks lean hard on CapEx. New meters, upgraded treatment, cyber systems, leak detection pilots, some of it necessary, some time to lift earnings before an exit. The obligation sits quietly. Ratepayers must cover an allowed return plus depreciation plus operating costs. If the regulator resists, the company appeals. If the appeal stalls, the covenant speaks. Those covenants are the quiet muscle. Debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, says operating cash must be, say, 1.25 times debt payments. Miss it, and lenders can demand cash sweeps, restrict spending, or trigger step-up interest. Many deals add additional bonds tests, blocking new borrowing unless coverage holds, and rate covenants, obligating the utility to seek rates adequate to meet DSCR. Adequate becomes an order. File a rate case now. Now layer floating rate debt. For a decade, variable notes and swaps cut costs. Then rates rose. Overnight, the interest line fattened while volumes shrank from conservation and drought. The math cornered operators. Either breach coverage or raise rates mid-year. Councils got special meetings with slides that said extraordinary circumstances and no alternative. Residents got higher bills for using less water. Deferred maintenance doesn't help. Private owners earn on new steel in the ground, not on fixing what doesn't add to the rate base. So you see optimization. Postponing repairs until they can be packaged as capital upgrades. Pipes keep leaking, non-revenue water grows. Crews patch reactive bursts while CapEx plans brag about smart meters and dashboards. Service feels worse while the bill climbs because the money is going to assets that yield returns, not to gaskets that don't. Regulatory capture doesn't arrive with a villain, it shows up in framing. Rate cases come with binders labeled resilience and compliance. Consultants present risk matrices. The required investments sound existential: drought-proofing, wildfire hardening, PFAS treatment. Much of it is real, but the price path is structured to protect investors first. Multi-year rate plans lock in escalators. Automatic pass-throughs recover power costs and chemicals. If the storm knocks out pumps, the utility seeks a surcharge to claw back lost revenue because you couldn't consume the water they couldn't deliver. Then there's take or pay. Cities sign supply agreements that require payment whether deliveries occur or not. The rationale is understandable. Suppliers need certainty to finance projects. But when rivers run low or a conveyance canal goes offline, the city still wires cash. Pair that with no substitution clauses, and a buyer can't meet demand by tapping cheaper alternatives during an outage. They're forced to buy scarcity at peak prices or pay penalties for not doing so. Either way, the bill grows while the tap sputters. Public finance pressure adds a metronome. Rating agencies watch DSCR like hawks. A utility with declining coverage or rising variable rate exposure earns a negative outlook. A notch down raises borrowing costs, which raises rates, which depresses usage, which hits coverage, a loop. City councils facing a downgrade often choose the least bad option. Approve a hike and promise a study later. Later rarely lowers a bill. Here's a midnight microstory. The council chamber hums under fluorescent lights. Staff hands out an urgent memo. The utility's DSCR will slip to 1.19x next quarter. The lender's waiver expires in 10 days. Without action, the margin steps up 300 basis points and a cash sweep starts, pulling reserves the city needs for payroll. The bond rating desk has already called twice. A consultant walks them through temporary volumetric surcharges and drought cost recovery mechanisms. Translation: raise rates now or accept a downgrade you can't afford. The vote passes at 12:04 a.m. The microphones click off. Outside, a mother holding a shut-off notice stares at the poster that promised affordable, reliable water. Meanwhile, conservation, good public policy, collides with the revenue model. Sell fewer gallons and revenues fall unless fixed charges rise. Utilities respond by raising the fixed portion of bills, insulating cash from behavior. The price signal dulls for high users, while low-income households who already use little pay more just to be connected. Equity takes a back seat to coverage. Add one more pinch point: inflation escalators. Contracts often tie allowed returns to CPI or construction indices. When everything gets expensive, your bill automatically ratchets higher to preserve investor yield. If your income didn't keep up, that's your problem. The clause doesn't care. Put it together and you get the paradox. Service can degrade while prices rise because the contract rewards financial performance over physical performance. The pipes leak, but the rate base grows. Pumps fail, but the DSCR holds. Customers conserve, but fixed charges climb. And any attempt to pause the treadmill risks tripping covenants designed to ring a bell the minute someone tries to slow down. All of this isn't an argument against investment. It's a map of incentives. When essential infrastructure is financed like a growth asset, the priority is protecting returns, not minimizing shutoffs. When the weather turns against you, the debt trap tightens. And when the trap tightens, politics turns brittle. That's how quiet clauses become loud anger at a kitchen sink. The food angle: crops choose finance, not rain. While households argue over shutoff notices, the real rationing is happening out in the fields. In scarcity, water follows contracts, not clouds. And the crops that win are the ones that can turn a senior right into cash on a schedule investors like. Start with hierarchy. Senior rights weren't handed to salad greens. They sit with legacy canals and districts that now anchor permanent plantings: almonds, pistachios, vineyards, export hay. Those crops aren't planted season by season. They're 30-year commitments with debt attached. Miss a year of irrigation, and you don't just lose a harvest. You lose trees you financed with a loan that assumed water would show up. That loan has covenants too. So when drought hits, senior water stays glued to orchards and vineyards because default risk beats lettuce wilt in any banker's memo. Meanwhile, junior rights, often tied to row crops like tomatoes, onions, and local feed, get cut first. The math pushes acreage toward whatever can prepay for reliability. An almond processor can structure long-term offtake contracts, hedge currency risk for export, and justify leasing carryover water at a premium. A lettuce grower selling into a price-sensitive domestic market can't. So the water goes where the spreadsheet pays more, not where the grocery aisle needs stability. Trading accelerates this. A city short on supply will lease from senior holders. That deal looks efficient on paper. Move water to higher value use. In practice, the water leaves fields that fed regional dairies and ends up in urban taps for a summer. Dairies then buy feed from out of basin, alfalfa grown with someone else's water, shipped by diesel, priced off a futures curve. The milk costs more before it hits your cereal because water decided to take a bus to town. Here's the quiet price you pay twice. First at the meter, second at the checkout. Irrigation is energy. Pumps that run deeper in drought drink more power. When water allocations drop, farmers turn to wells and spot purchases, both of which cost more per acre-foot. Those costs don't vanish. They ride the supply chain into produce, meat, and dairy. Virtual water is the hidden gallon count embedded in everything you eat. A pound of beef carries a water story measured in thousands of gallons, most of it in feed. When local water gets expensive, that story imports scarcity from somewhere else and charges you for the shipping. Finance shapes the crop map with more than rights. It uses term sheets. Private funds offer sale leasebacks on farmland. Sell us the land, lease it back for 20 years, and we'll handle capex for efficient irrigation. Sounds helpful until the lease requires minimum production and prioritizes permanent plantings that lock in water demand. If allocations fall, the farmer can't pivot to dry-farmed grains without breaching the lease. The contract has more gravity than the sky. Options creep in too. Water options give orchards the right, but not the obligation, to buy extra deliveries if a trigger hits. In a bad year, they exercise, crowding out junior growers who hoped spot prices would soften. If the options are paired with storage, the orchard's operator can smooth deliveries just enough to keep trees alive while neighbors bulldoze fields. Survival isn't about who's efficient, it's about who prepaid for flexibility. Then there's export gravity. High-value crops sell abroad when the dollar is friendly and shipping lanes behave. The foreign buyer doesn't care how your local grocery bill looks. If overseas demand pays more, water's marginal gallon will go to an export crop. That's rational at the farm gate and brutal at the family table. You end up subsidizing someone else's snack with a higher bill for basics. None of this is the farmer's fault. They're squeezed from both ends, input costs and volatile prices. When conservation mandates kick in, many get told to fallow land to save water. Some programs pay, many don't pay enough. Meanwhile, the fixed costs tied to permanent plantings and leases don't shrink. So you see desperate deals. Farmers sell a chunk of their senior rights permanently to keep the bank calm. The basin loses flexibility, and the next drought bites deeper. A micro beat from the packing shed. A grower stares at a spreadsheet with 3 columns. Lease payment due, option premium due, spot water price today. The option is expensive but cheaper than replacing trees. The lease doesn't care about rainfall. The spot price just jumped because a city across the valley triggered its no substitution clause. He signs the wire. 2 months later, his neighbor rips up a tomato field and lists the pump on Craigslist. The grocery store reflects this shuffle like a mirror that's slow to fog. Prices creep, then jump. Eggs ride feed costs. Cheese rides alfalfa. Lettuce disappears not because rain didn't fall in your county, but because water moved 3 counties over on paper and never returned as tailwater your well relied on. A kid in your town asks why strawberries cost more this summer. The answer lives in a contract you'll never read. There are paths to bend this. Some regions prioritize drought reserve for local staples, creating floors under crops that feed the area. Others tax carryover volumes past a threshold to discourage hoarding. A few push deficit irrigation pilots for permanent crops. Stress the trees just enough to survive, pay growers for the lost yield, keep water in the basin for food crops and taps. It works when trust is real and payments are prompt. It fails when the check arrives after the tree dies. Households feel it twice by design. Scarcity turns water into money in the field and on the street. Finance follows the higher bid. Without rules that protect staple food supply and human use, the market will keep doing its job. And you'll keep paying for it with thinner lawns, thinner wallets, and a growing sense that dinner got more expensive because a clause somewhere decided it should be. Case Study A. The basin that went dry on paper first. 3 summers before our suburb's 48-hour notice, a valley 200 miles away learned what it means to run out of water on paper before the river ran out in real life. Locals called it the basin, like there was only one. On maps it had a number, an adjudicated groundwater bowl stitched to a canal grid. On balance sheets, it was a portfolio. The warning sign wasn't a cracked riverbed. It was a court letter that arrived in March. Annual allocation cut to 42% of native safe yield. Hydrology was mediocre, not catastrophic. But the models said conservation, so everyone's share shrank. Senior rights shrugged. They'd banked carryover credits from a wet winter. Juniors blinked. Their percentage on paper fell below what their pumps and contracts needed. A small city on the basin's eastern edge had run lean for years. No desal, no imported allocation big enough to matter. Just a blend of production rights, seasonal canal buys, and a handshake understanding that neighbors swapped water when heat spikes hit. They'd modernized just enough to pass audits. They hadn't modernized their contracts. That's where the investor shows up. 2 years earlier, a fund bought a bundle. Distressed junior production rights, a chunk of canal conveyance shares, and a fat block of storage credits in the basin's preferred underground bank. The price looked rich to locals. The fund's thesis was simple. Pair juniors with storage, use carryover to smooth dry years, then sell reliability to buyers who waited too long. The target buyer list had one line: the city. Summer came early. Evaporation bit storage losses harder than usual. A brush fire upriver dumped ash into intake screens, throttling canal deliveries for a week. None of that was dramatic enough for cable news. All of it mattered to math. The city's blend broke. Their production rights, already cut by the 42% allocation, couldn't meet demand. Conservation messaging shaved usage, but heat erased those gains. They called the fund. Negotiations started polite. The fund offered a seasonal lease of stored water delivered through its conveyance shares. The price was steep but survivable. Then the clause appeared. The fund wanted a no substitution provision. If the city signed, it couldn't meet this contracted volume with any other source for the term. The city balked. The fund pointed to its storage model. Without that clause, it couldn't commit the water without risking being undercut by a late cheap canal pulse. Translation: pay for certainty and lock yourself in. The council hesitated. Staff hunted for alternatives. A neighboring district floated a friendly swap on paper. The court's watermaster flagged no injury concerns. Move that much water and downstream return flows would suffer. Litigation loomed. The friendly swap vanished into memos. The city came back to the fund. The fund had adjusted for market conditions. The price stepped up. Then the drought trigger hit. Not in the sky, on a spreadsheet. The Canal Authority, spooked by upstream turbidity and a maintenance failure at a lift station, curtailed deliveries for 2 weeks to keep sediment out of turbines. The city's last buffer evaporated. At 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, an emergency item landed on the council agenda. Authorized purchase of 4,000 acre-feet from the fund at peak pricing. Agreed to no substitution for 90 days. Wire half by Friday. A micro moment from that meeting. The city treasurer flipping a stapled packet, lips tight. Line 3. Failure to execute will materially impair projected DSCR in Q3, rating outlook at risk. She had 72 hours to keep the utility out of a covenant breach or accept a downgrade that would raise borrowing costs for the next decade. Her phone lit with a bank number she'd saved as don't ignore. They signed. Water moved, physically and on paper, through the fund's conveyance capacity. Households saw conservation pleas deepen, but taps kept sputtering back. The fund delivered the contracted volumes, net of loss factors. The city paid, net of nothing. 90 days later, temperatures eased. The bills didn't. In the aftermath, the math showed its teeth. The emergency buys blew a crater in the water budget. Mid-year, the utility filed for an extraordinary rate adjustment to preserve DSCR. The rating agency removed the negative outlook but noted heightened event risk. The city's bonds didn't fall apart, they just cost more to carry. Ratepayers were told the spike was temporary. The emergency surcharges stuck around long enough to feel permanent. Lawsuits piled anyway. Downstream well owners claimed injury from the transfers changed return flows. Environmental groups pushed on minimum flows the basin had promised years earlier and quietly shorted with carryover hoarding. The fund lawyered up and pointed at permits and hydrologic studies. Everything had a paper trail. Nothing satisfied the people whose wells hissed air when pumps kicked. Here's the part that stung. When winter finally brought decent storms, the basin's storage banks declared themselves operationally full. The aquifer had capacity on paper, storage credits, but limited physical room for new recharge without violating accounting balances. Stormwater ran off in brown sheets, filling the river for a minute and racing out to sea. Locals asked why the basin couldn't swallow more. The watermaster answered truthfully, "We're full." The silence after that sentence could have swallowed a room. Politicians promised investigations. Consultants arrived with dashboards. The fund updated its investor letter. Our integrated water platform demonstrated resilience, delivering contracted volumes during regional stress and capturing scarcity value in line with expectations. The city updated its website FAQ. Why did my bill increase when I used less? The answers, both sets, were accurate. Neither made anyone feel better. What did the basin teach? Dryness isn't the only threat. Paper scarcity can hit first, triggered by carryover that tightens supply, conveyance choke points that raise basis risk, and clauses that turn a bad month into a budget crisis. Investors didn't break the pipe. They built a machine that profits when others can't move. The city didn't fail to plan. It failed to plan for a world where the plan is a contract someone else wrote. Meanwhile, the tech fix was rolling into town with a ribbon and a promise. Desalination had a brochure and a 30-year payment schedule. The basin had bruises and a memory. The desalination promise and the balance sheet reality. After the basin's bruising summer, a glossy promise rolled in on a flatbed truck. Unlimited water, pulled from the ocean, immune to drought, engineered to taste like mountain snow. Desalination doesn't argue with rain. It prints reliability. Politically, that's catnip. Financially, it's a contract with a gym membership you're legally not allowed to cancel. Here's how the brochure reads. A private consortium will design, build, finance, and operate a plant. The city pays an availability fee, capacity charges whether or not every gallon is taken, plus a per unit rate for delivered water. 25 to 30 years, indexed for inflation, with pass-throughs for power, chemicals, and compliance. It's Project Finance 101. Lenders want guaranteed revenue. Equity wants a predictable exit. Ratepayers become the annuity. On paper, availability payments look fair. The plan exists even on cloudy Tuesdays. Someone has to pay the mortgage. In practice, capacity morphs into a fixed monthly bill that doesn't care if winter storms refill reservoirs or a conservation campaign cuts demand. If the city takes less, the fee doesn't budge. If a drought emergency hits and usage collapses, the fee doesn't budge. The escalator, however, never forgets to climb. Energy is the quiet tyrant. Pushing salt out of seawater takes electricity. Lots. Tie your water to a power price, and you've stapled the bill to a commodity that spikes when you can least afford it. Plants hedge power. Some lock long-term contracts. Some ride the market with caps. Either way, the clause reads the same. Energy cost pass-through. Translation: the utility pays whatever electrons cost, and then you do. Stranded asset risk hides in optimism. A city signs for 50 million gallons a day because it sounds safe. A decade later, conservation norms, leak reduction, and smarter pricing drop base demand. Imported water portfolios get reworked. Suddenly the plant is oversized. You still pay the availability fee because that's the deal. The operator smiles, lenders sleep, councils hold press conferences about optimizing utilization. Exit timing is where private equity earns its stripes. The consortium front-loads construction risk and political heat. Once the plant is online and the first rate case bakes payments into the tariff, equity trims its stake to pensions and insurers hungry for yield. The spreadsheets show operating phase de-risked. The public is married to a 30-year obligation. The original sponsors are already on their next ribbon. A micro-story from a ribbon cutting. A mayor holds giant scissors. A child pours a beaker of clear water into a glass. The crowd claps. Year 1, the plant hums. Year 2, a heat dome drives power prices through the roof. The operator triggers the pass-through. Bills jump. Year 3, a series of storms refills local storage, but minimum take clauses require the city to buy a set volume anyway. Residents ask why they're paying for desalinated water while reservoirs spill. The answer is honest and infuriating. Contractual obligations. Project finance protects lenders with covenants, debt service reserves, step-up interest, even termination payments if politics goes feral. Misavailability targets? The operator pays liquidated damages, often capped. Mispayments? The city faces cross-defaults that yank at other borrowing. A clever negotiator can narrow some teeth. The molars remain. Then there's conveyance. A plant on the coast isn't a faucet in your kitchen. You need pipes, pumps, and interties to move that water inland. Those costs live in separate line items, each with its own depreciation schedules and return allowances. The unglamorous steel doubles the bill while the brochure kept the lens on a glittering intake with fish-friendly screens. Environmental approvals shaped the chessboard. Brine disposal, marine life impacts, shoreline siting, real constraints that add cost and delay. In some places, concentrate gets blended into deep ocean outfalls. In others, it's injected underground or trucked with all the romance of a landfill invoice. Each fix has a permit clock. Each clock costs money. Supporters will say, it's drought insurance. Fine. Price the premium honestly. Insurance you can pause has value. Insurance you must buy in a flood feels like a prank. If the plant's minimum annual payment equals what you'd spend building cheaper local supply, recycled water, stormwater capture, fixing leaks, you've bought a gold-plated policy to avoid the optics of asking people to use less. There's a better version. Public first terms, no minimum take in wet years, caps on energy pass-throughs, shared upside if financing gets refinanced cheaper, and transparency on affiliate contracts so nobody hides profit in management fees. Pair the plant with aggressive demand management and tiered rates that protect basic use while charging lawn luxuries. Use it as a peak shaving asset, not a baseline crutch. But that version requires leverage at the table. Cities need independent advisors, not cheerleaders. They need open books on the sponsor's debt and swaps. They need stress tests that model multi-year wet periods, not just apocalyptic dry ones. And they need the political spine to say no when the contract tries to turn a backup generator into your main grid. Back in the basin, the desal pitch landed hard because never again sells. Leaders who lived through trucked-in water and emergency surcharges wanted a silver bullet. What they were offered was a silver mortgage. Useful. Sometimes. Inevitable? No. The plant is a tool. The balance sheet decides whether it becomes a shackle. And if tech won't save us from bad contracts, governance has to. The next scene isn't a shiny intake. It's a city hall agenda with fine print that either keeps a community solvent or writes a check it can't stop writing. International flashpoints. When water privatization broke social order. While the basin argued in courtrooms, other places learned in the streets what happens when contracts outrun consent. 3 flashpoints, Bolivia, South Africa, Australia, show the same pattern with different accents, price, power, and a public that decides the ledger isn't legitimate. Start in Cochabamba, 200. A Bechtel-linked consortium takes the city's system under a 40-year concession. The promise is upgrades. The reality hits mailboxes. Bills jump for families who were already spending a painful slice of income on water. The concession folds in side rights, control over rural systems, and even fees on private wells, fuel on dry kindling. Protests build from plazas to pitched street battles. 9 people die. The government cancels the contract. For months after, lawyers fight in international arbitration, while residents rebuild trust with buckets and local committees. It wasn't just about price. It was about legitimacy. Who gets to decide how far an essential service can be leveraged before it stops being a service? Shift to Cape Town, 2018. Day zero becomes a countdown clock. Dams slip toward 13.5%. The level where taps would shut and distribution points would replace kitchens. The city imposes severe rationing, 50 liters per person per day. People queue with jerrycans. Tourism hangs in the balance. Agriculture takes a body blow. Here, the villain isn't a concessionaire. It's a convergence of drought, delayed augmentation, and political feuds. But you still see contract logic strain civic patience. Wealthy neighborhoods truck private supplies. Informal settlements already living with communal taps ask what crisis means when their ordinary day looks like everyone else's emergency. Cape Town averts day zero through unprecedented conservation and rain. The lesson isn't triumphalism. It's how thin the margin is when demand, climate, and governance miss each other by a season. Now to Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, where the marketization of water is policy, not a loophole. Rights are unbundled. You can own a share of a river's long-term yield and trade annual allocations like a crop insurance policy. In theory, this allocates water to highest value, protects the environment with planned flows, and gives farmers flexibility. In practice, drought tightens allocations, prices spike, and permanent plantings with deep pockets outbid annual crops. Fish die in stagnant, superheated reaches. Communities accuse water barons of hoarding. Audits find governance gaps and questionable buys in environmental programs. The market didn't cause the drought, it amplified its winners and losers. When flows return, trust doesn't recover as quickly. What threads these together isn't just anger. It's the moment when people realize the fine print changed what water is. In Cochabamba, a concession felt like a mortgage signed in a language the city didn't speak. In Cape Town, behavioral fixes had to arrive faster than politics ever moves. In the Murray-Darling, transparency lagged the complexity of trades. Third-party impacts, towns, ecosystems, sat off balance sheet. Bring that back to our suburb. You can tell a resident, the model says affordability remains within benchmarks, and they'll hold up a bill that doubled. You can explain take or pay and minimum offtake, and they'll ask why a rainy winter didn't lower their charge. If the answer boils down to, because the contract says so, you've turned an engineering problem into a legitimacy crisis. The flashpoints also show what helps. Transparency comes first. When Cochabamba remunicipalized, neighborhood committees helped set priorities and watch the books. It wasn't pretty, but it was visible. In Cape Town, real-time dam data and per-household usage dashboards created social pressure that mattered. People could see their neighbors' restraint and their own waste. In the Murray-Darling, reforms pushed for public registers of trades, disclosure of intermediary profits, and caps on certain positions to keep markets from becoming casinos with rivers as chips. None of that solves hydrology. It does put a floor under rumor, which spreads faster than dry brush. Then there's the environmental floor. When a system treats environmental flows as negotiable, they become the first victim of price spikes and the last beneficiary of relief. The fish kills in Australia weren't just sad, they were a balance sheet warning. Lose the ecological plumbing, and you pay more to move worse water through a system that gets sicker each season. Every contract should sit on a non-derogable base. Human needs and minimum ecological health come first, not as a surcharge on scarcity, but as a precondition for any trade or concession. Finally, third-party harm needs teeth. Transfers that strand towns, dry wells, or collapse local economies can't be called efficient with a straight face. Compensation funds, transition support, and no. Injury tests with enforcement muscle don't make everyone whole, but they make the winners pay into the community they're reshaping. In the absence of that, the community sends an invoice the only way it can, by blocking roads. Here's the dark humor. The fastest way to kill investor confidence is to pretend social consent is a rounding error. If you want durable returns from an essential service, build legitimacy into the deal. Make the books open. Share upside when hedges pay. Cap pass-throughs that turn a drought into a windfall. Otherwise, your spreadsheet will meet a saucepan in a plaza, and the saucepan will win. These places aren't warnings from some other planet. They're mirrors tilted forward in time. If your town treats water as a spreadsheet cell with a price but no politics, you're already on the on-ramp. The next section shows how those politics jump the median and slam into finance. The contagion you won't see until someone says, "Wire the money in 72 hours or else." Contagion mechanics. How pumping rights become the next crisis. Contagion doesn't need a crash. It needs a clause plus a dry season. Start at the lender's desk. Over the last decade, banks and non-banks took water rights and long-term supply contracts as collateral. A senior pumping right looks like gold: priority deliveries, scarcity upside, lease income. It slots into loan books with low default expectations because humans will always buy water. Then allocations fall. The right still exists, but projected cash flows don't. Mark-to-market rules whisper first, then shout. The loan's collateral haircut widens. A borrower that looked fine at 70% loan-to-value suddenly sits at 92%. That's when the margin calls begin. Funds holding pooled rights face the same math. Investors ask for redemptions when headlines say, "Water emergency." To raise cash, managers sell what they can, not what they should. The most liquid pieces, exchange-traded futures, index hedges, hit the market first. Prices swing. The hedge that was supposed to buffer utility budgets gets dumped to meet withdrawals, right when basis risk is already gnawing at local buyers. Insurance wrappers, tied to parametric triggers, don't pay if the index misses by a hair, so treasurers hold the bag and liquid markets hiccup. A drought becomes a cash flow event across desks that never saw the canal. Meanwhile, municipal finance feels the tremor. Utilities rely on rate-backed bonds with covenants keyed to DSCR and liquidity days on hand. An emergency water purchase or a take-or-pay obligation pulls cash. Coverage slips. The rating desk calls with outlook negative. A single notch down raises interest costs across the city's portfolio, not just water. Pension obligations, transit upgrades, school roofs, all cost more to finance because a pump station failed and a clause fired. Cross defaults lurk in the footnotes. Some enterprise systems pledge to keep rates adequate for all bonded debt. Miss that, and other lenders gain rights to ring the bell. Here's where it gets systemic. The same pensions paying retirees in your town also own slices of the private equity platforms buying utilities in someone else's town. They also hold munis from dozens of water districts. And yes, they own shares of infrastructure funds with storage and rights. When drought hits multiple basins, southwest, plains, parts of Australia, correlation spikes. Those funds mark down assets. Pensions see portfolio stress and raise liquidity. To cover, they sell liquid holdings first: muni funds, utilities, insurers. Prices fall, yields rise. Your city, planning a routine bond sale, suddenly faces higher rates because global investors are raising cash for reasons that rhyme with your weather. Banks add their own feedback. Loans secured by farmland with senior water rights once looked bulletproof. But if transfer rules tighten, if carryover gets taxed, if environmental floors bite, the farm's optionality shrinks. Appraisers cut values. Lines of credit get trimmed. Farmers sell water to survive, but permanent transfers can strand local processors, dairies, canneries, that anchor employment and tax base. City revenues soften just as utility obligations harden. The bond market notices the narrowing cushion. That's how a drought in the county becomes a line item in the city's offering statement, which becomes a basis point penalty that lasts years. Then consider derivatives. Some utilities used swaps to stabilize variable rate debt. Rising rates push swap values deep underwater for counterparties. Collateral calls force those counterparties, often dealers tied to big banks, to raise cash, sometimes by selling risk elsewhere, including in the very water futures markets local treasurers used. It's a loop. Stress in one contract drains cushions in another, and the price of certainty turns uncertain when liquidity vanishes. Now add the clause cocktail. No substitution forces cities to buy from specified sources during shortages. Take or pay compels payment even if volumes don't arrive. Carryover, hoarding squeezes spot markets. Stack them, and you can engineer a municipal cash crunch without a biblical drought. Once multiple cities in a region hit that pinch at once, regional bond indices widen. Index tracking funds sell to match outflows. Retail investors see negative total returns in safe-sounding muni funds and pull money, accelerating the sell-off. The cost of water infrastructure funding rises just when repairs are most urgent. Insurance is not a clean exit. Parametric drought covers settle fast, but only at thresholds. If payouts miss, utilities that counted on them pivot to emergency borrowing. Credit lines fill. Banks, eyeing sector exposure, cap new commitments. Smaller districts, lacking relationships, pay more or get nothing. That bifurcation sends customers in poorer towns into shut-off spirals, while wealthier suburbs secure temporary sources at premium prices. Political pressure climbs. Legislatures float moratoria on rate hikes or shutoffs. Credit analysts hear political interference and notch risk higher. The cycle tightens. International capital amplifies this. Sovereign funds and global infra managers rebalance across continents. If Australia's basin melts down while the American West tightens, they'll protect platform returns by shifting capital, sometimes selling North American positions to cover Asia-Pac redemptions or vice versa. Local headlines say nothing material changed, but spreads move because allocations in a Riyadh or Toronto investment committee changed. Your city council gets one more reminder that money is global while taps are local. The hidden vector is pensions versus ratepayers. Teachers and firefighters rely on funds invested in the very contracts raising their bills. When pensions push for higher real assets allocations, they increase ownership in utilities and water platforms that pass costs through. A drought year becomes a transfer from households to retirement portfolios, then back to households through taxes when budgets strain. People sense the circularity even if they can't map it. Trust phrase faster than pipes. What turns all of this from stress to crisis is simultaneity. Multi-basin drought, power price spikes, wildfire ash, a key canal outage, and a legal fight over environmental flows can stack in a single quarter. If 3 or 4 of those hit, DSCR breaches cascade, redemptions jump, insurers tighten, and ratings wobble across dozens of issuers at once. That's when a clause nobody voted on becomes a headline everyone feels. There is a fuse you can actually point to. Hidden in many supply deals is the pair we've been circling. Carryover, that concentrates bargaining power, and no substitution, that removes escape routes. Light them in a dry year, and the spark runs along every covenant in town. The next section opens that contract and shows how a single paragraph can force a city to wire money it doesn't have for water it can't get. The clause, carryover, and no substitution triggers. Open the contract drawer, and there it is, the paragraph that teaches a city how to panic. Carryover sounds prudent, like saving for a dry day. In practice, it's a throttle. A rights holder can bank unused allocation into next year, often with modest loss factors. In a tight basin, that's leverage. Hold back now, and you raise today's spot price. Sit on a large carryover block, and you set tomorrow's price too. The spreadsheet calls it inventory. The household calls it, why did my bill just jump? Layer in the cousin clause, no substitution. It reads benignly. Buyer agrees not to fulfill contracted volumes from alternative sources. But scarcity isn't benign. If your imported supply falters or a canal goes down, you can't pivot to a neighbor's intertie or a short-term farm lease. You're locked into the seller's schedule and price, or you pay penalties for non-performance. The seller holds the map. You hold the invoice. The real mischief arrives when the two pair up. A large holder banks carry over through a wet winter. Summer turns mean. The holder offers reliability, deliveries out of storage, priced for market conditions. The no substitution clause strips your plan B. Meanwhile, your own conservation messaging depresses usage and, perversely, revenues. Debt covenants blink. You walk into a negotiation with a time bomb in your pocket and a rating analyst breathing on your neck. Here's how it plays inside a water department. Week 1 of heat. Allocations look okay. You lean on the usual blend. Week 2, a pump motor fails on an export canal, and turbidity limits drop flows. Your operations team cuts pressure at night to nurse reservoirs. Week 3, your treasurer forwards a lender email. Coverage will slip if you fund emergency spot buys without a surcharge. The seller's term sheet arrives. Storage release is available, but contingent on a 90-day no substitution rider and a prepayment wired in 48 hours. You book the council chamber. The take or pay wrinkle makes this uglier. Some contracts require paying for capacity you might not fully use, especially when they're paired with carryover banks. You pay to reserve water, then you pay again if you actually take it, often at an indexed rate. If deliveries are curtailed by force majeure that's conveniently broad, wildfire ash, power outages, environmental constraints, you still owe the reservation fee. Payment immediacy meets litigation latency. Lawyers will argue later about what was available. The bill is due Friday. Now toss the no-injury world into the mix. You found a friendly transfer that could have eased your crunch, but modeling showed downstream return flows would suffer. The watermaster flagged it. Opponents lawyered up. The option vanished. With no substitution in your emergency lease, even a late, court-blessed trickle from elsewhere can't legally fill your contracted volumes. You're paying peak scarcity for gallons you might have sourced cheaper a week later. That's not inefficiency, it's design. There's a political booby trap too. Carryover hoarding is legal. It looks antisocial when taps sputter. Sellers remind you they paid loss factors and storage fees to carry risk. Residents won't care. They hear that someone sat on water while rates climbed. Councils reach for windfall taxes on carryover or emergency release mandates. Those moves trigger lawsuits that drag on while this month's payment clock runs. The seller's incentives don't change. The public's patience does. The kicker is evaporation math. Many contracts apply standardized loss rates to stored water. Heat waves don't read contracts. If actual losses exceed modeled losses, the delta lands in argument land. Meanwhile, delivery schedules stick. A buyer expecting 10,000 acre-feet net might receive 9,300. Discover the shortfall in reconciliation, and still owe full reservation and minimum take. You can recover something later, perhaps as future credits. Today's DSCR doesn't accept IOUs. Micromoment. A city treasurer at 6:42 a.m., coffee going cold, rereads a clause labeled Substitution Prohibited, seller's sole cure. It says if the seller can't deliver for approved reasons, the buyer's remedy is rescheduling within the term. No refunds, no third-party purchases credited. She looks at the calendar. The term ends August 31st. It's August 12th. School starts in a week. She drafts the memo nobody wants to sign. Why do utilities sign these? Because the alternative is showing up empty when heat spikes hit. Reliability sells. Sellers demand protection against being gamed by buyers who'd lock capacity, then whipsaw them with cheap late-season alternatives. So the clause exists for a reason. The problem is proportion. In an essential service, a seller's risk shouldn't erase a buyer's agency. Contracts wrote out agency, one sole remedy, at a time. There are defenses. Cap carryover volumes, or tax them progressively to discourage hoarding beyond operational needs. Require release schedules that prioritize municipal health and staple crops during declared emergencies, with compensation mechanisms funded by the very scarcity premium sellers earn. Ban rigid no substitution. Allow reasonable substitution with notice and equitable true PS, so sellers aren't sandbagged and buyers aren't trapped. Tie any take or pay to verifiable physical availability, not paper excuses. Narrow force majeure to what physics actually made impossible. Transparency helps. Public registries of carryover balances, scheduled releases, affiliated contracts, and real-time conveyance constraints strip mystery out of price spikes. Sunlight doesn't lower hydrology, it lowers speculation. And embed a simple override. In a declared human health emergency, substitution and prorata sharing beat exclusivity. Automatically, by law, with compensation handled after, not before. Because here's the quiet truth. The clause didn't cause the drought. It turned a dry month into a fiscal emergency. When a paragraph can force a city to wire millions for water it can't fully receive, the market isn't allocating, it's appropriating. And once enough towns learn that lesson in the same season, the fight moves from contracts to councils, and then to courts that suddenly discover what public interest means under heat. Playbook, how cities and citizens fight back. If clauses light the fuse, governance cuts the wire. The good news is there's a playbook. It isn't glamorous. It's checklists, daylight, and boring meetings that decide whether your kitchen sink depends on a spreadsheet in another zip code. Start with ownership. Remunicipalization sounds radical until you run the math. Cities have bought systems back when concessions failed service tests or price caps were gamed. The leverage isn't rage, it's disclosure. Force open the books, affiliate contracts, management fees, swap positions, side letters. When residents see who gets paid for advisory services, council votes to exit stop being theoretical. Build a valuation that excludes acquisition premiums from the rate base. If the seller insists on being made whole, voters get to decide if a decade of higher bills is worth yesterday's mistake. Next, put a trust on the water, not on promises. Public water trusts create a fiduciary duty to residents, not to yield. Boards include utility staff, labor, low-income advocates, and a hydrologist who doesn't care about slogans. Their job is simple. Human use first, ecological floor next, everything else negotiable. Decisions get minutes, not mysteries. If a transfer would strand a town or drain a stretch of river, the trust prices that harm into the deal or says no. Fix rates like they're a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Lifeline rates make the first block of use, the water you need to live, cheap. Above that, prices stair-step quickly. Mansions that keep lawns green in August fund pipe replacements and emergency reserves. Pair it with income-based discounts and shut-off protections. You can't conserve your way out of poverty, but you can stop punishing people for bathing. And when drought hits, layer temporary surcharges on luxury classes, not base use. Build your own bank. Local water banks run by public agencies can store wet year water and allocate it under rules that don't reward hoarding. Publish balances in real time. Cap carryover beyond operational needs, or tax it so the holding cost reflects community risk. Include a release ladder. Hospitals, schools, staple crops, then everything else by proportion. Make speculation boring and reliability visible. End the booby traps. Ban no substitution clauses for essential utilities. If a seller demands protection, give them a fair true-up. If a buyer substitutes and the seller had real costs to be ready, they get reimbursed. But the buyer keeps agency. Narrow force majeure until it maps to physics, not convenience. Tie any take or pay to verifiable, metered availability with automatic price relief when the system fails. Write disclosure into law. Every significant contract should be online. Term sheets, hedges, side agreements, DSCR triggers, variable rate exposure, affiliate relationships, and the minutes of every negotiation session. Post-outage logs, leak rates, and repair backlogs. Sunlight makes it hard to claim unexpected when the warning was page 3, line 7, last year. Change the incentive to fix the unglamorous. Tie executive bonuses to leak reduction, shut-off prevention, and worker retention, not just CAPEX delivered. Reward meter accuracy only if paired with real loss declines. Celebrate trenchless rehab more than ribbon cuttings. If maintenance beats optics, your system stops bleeding money into the ground while you buy hedges to protect a leaky status quo. Arm councils with independence. Hire advisors who don't bid on future work. Fund an office that models clauses from the resident's perspective. How does this term behave in a 3-year drought with a power spike? Build scenarios that include correlated shocks. Put the models on a website. Let residents test assumptions. You'll get crowdsourced error checking and fewer nobody-could-have-known speeches. Make farmers partners, not targets. Form basin compacts. Pay orchards for deficit irrigation that keeps trees alive while freeing water for staples and taps. Share savings when cities avoid peak price buys because growers flexed. Create crop switch incentives that reflect debt realities. Don't ask a farmer to lose a decade of equity for a public good and then stiff them on timing. Set a baseline. Staple foods grown within the basin get priority in declared emergencies, priced fairly, with transparent accounting. Use procurement like policy. If you buy desal, recycled water, or storage services, bake in public first terms. Cap energy pass-throughs with shared savings incentives for efficiency. Require refinancing gains to flow to ratepayers. Put minimum take floors below drought-era base use, so you don't pay for capacity you can't use. Mandate community oversight seats with veto rights over amendments that add risk without debate. Train for crisis before it arrives. Run dry run council nights where staff rehearses what happens when a canal fails and a seller's term sheet arrives with a 48-hour clock. Pre-authorize substitution protocols, emergency interties, and surcharge designs that protect base use. Build a joint communications plan that says, in plain language, what's happening, who's paying, and for how long. Rumor fills silence as fast as a basin empties. Push state law forward. Ban fair market value markups that let private buyers roll premiums into rates. Impose a public benefit test on transfers. If third-party harm is real, compensation is mandatory, funded by the deal. Set non-derogable human and environmental floors. Basic household use and minimum ecosystem flows sit outside trading games. Cap leverage. Against water rights and require disclosure of collateral concentrations. Tell futures markets. Hedgers only, position limits, and transparency on who's holding the risk. At the household level, act like a shareholder. Read your utilities CFR, not just the bill insert. Look up EMA filings. If you see DSCR sliding and variable rate notes rising, show up to the mic. Ask for affiliate audits and debt ladders. If a contract includes no substitution, ask for a backup plan in writing. If your city lacks a water bank, ask why. If your council says confidential, remind them it's your water, your taxes, your kitchen. One more lever, align pensions with ratepayers. If the retirement fund invests in the utility's private owner, demand responsible terms. No take or pay without availability, no substitution, shared upside on refinancings. Fiduciary duty includes not lighting your own members' bills on fire. Make that explicit in policy. None of this is romantic. It's 1,000 small guardrails that turn scarcity into management instead of extraction. You won't beat the drought with a slogan. You will keep your town solvent with contracts that remember what the pipes are for. Policy levers that actually bite. We've seen how governance can cut the wire. Now we harden the box. Real fixes aren't slogans. They're rules that change incentives in the moment a clause tries to bite. Start where harm begins. Outlaw take or pay for essential utilities unless availability is physically verifiable and prorated. If a seller can't deliver net of measured conveyance and quality constraints, the price auto steps down or the obligation pauses. Pair that with a bright line ban on rigid no substitution. Allow reasonable substitution with notice and a fair true-up, so sellers recover real readiness costs, but can't trap buyers. This flips bargaining leverage in emergencies from wire by Friday to deliver or price adjusts. Next, impose a public benefit test on transfers. If a move strands a town, dries wells, or degrades staple crop supply, the deal must fund a compensation pool sized to the modeled harm and verified after the season. Make the pool pay first, before distributions to investors. Bake third-party injury into the price, so efficiency isn't a euphemism for cost shifting. Set non-derogable floors, a human-use minimum and environmental base flows that sit outside trading, banking, and carryover games. Not goals, rights. When allocations shrink, the first gallons meet household health and keep rivers alive. Everything else negotiates beneath that floor. This stabilizes politics and protects the ecological plumbing that keeps water treatable and conveyance reliable. On carryover, tax strategic hoarding, not prudence. Let operators roll reasonable volumes for operational continuity, with rising fees past a threshold. Publish balances in real time. Require scheduled release windows during declared emergencies, prioritized for municipal health and staple crops, with sellers paid, but not allowed to sit on the spigot while prices scream. If a basin declares itself full on paper while storms run to sea, regulators should be empowered to mandate space-making releases with compensation. Limit leverage against water rights. Cap loan-to-value and concentration, so one fund can't corner a basin's optionality. Require lenders to disclose collateralized rights by basin, priority class, and maturity profile. If a bank book has more than a set share tied to one hydrologic system, it adds capital or trims exposure. That turns mark-to-market panics into manageable bruises. Hedge markets need guardrails. Keep futures as tools for hedgers. Restrict speculative positions. Set position limits by participant, require end-user certification, and disclose aggregated long/short by region so treasurers can see who's leaning on their index. Mandate margin buffers that widen during multi-basin drought to avoid forced liquidations that shock prices right when utilities need stability. Indices should carry quality and conveyance adjustment factors with transparent methodology, audited annually. In contracts, convert force majeure from a fog to a map. Define it narrowly, physical impossibility, not inconvenience. Tie remedies to time. If delivery slips, price steps down on a schedule. If a threshold is missed, substitution rights snap on automatically. Prohibit sole remedy language in essential service agreements. Allow courts or regulators to impose equitable remedies in real time, not years later. Rate policy should protect the bottom while exposing luxury. Lock lifeline blocks at affordable levels for basic health. Above that, move quickly into steep tiers that reflect scarcity. Add drought surcharges only to higher tiers and non-essential uses, with sunset dates and public dashboards showing where that money goes. Leaks interties debt relief, not into general coffers. Disclosure is a lever. Pass laws that require public posting of every material water contract, affiliate arrangement, hedge, and covenant. Put DSCR, variable rate exposure, carryover balances, scheduled releases, outage logs, and leak rates on an open dashboard. If a city wants to sign a clause that limits substitution, it must hold a public hearing with an independent analysis of what happens under correlated shocks. Drought plus power spikes plus canal outages. Silence is how bad terms survive. Procurement should reward resilience, not glossy capex. Score bids on leak reduction, outage response, worker retention, and transparency commitments. Penalize bidders that stuff profits into affiliates. Require refinancing sharing clauses, so when debt gets cheaper, bills do too. For energy-intense projects like desal, cap pass-throughs and tie margins to efficiency benchmarks verified by third parties. State law can unblock local courage. Ban fair market value schemes that let acquirers roll premiums into rate bases. Require utilities to prove that privatization produces measurable service improvements per dollar spent, not just access to capital. Create a right to remunicipalize at depreciated asset value if service or affordability standards are missed for. A sustained period. Give regulators authority to unwind predatory terms in declared emergencies. Agriculture policy has to mesh. Fund deficit irrigation programs that pay orchards to keep trees alive while freeing water for staples and taps, with rapid payment and clear verification. Create crop switch incentives that don't vaporize a decade of equity. Prioritize local staple production in emergency release ladders. Build regional water banks with public governance where farmers and cities trade under rules that honor third-party protections and environmental floors. Align pensions with ratepayers. If public funds invest in water platforms, require adherence to a responsible contracts code. No rigid take or pay, no substitution, transparent carryover, equitable release protocols, and shared refinancing gains. Fiduciary duty includes not extracting from the same households that fund the pensions. Finally, install a circuit breaker. When multivariable triggers flash, allocations below a threshold, reservoir storage tight, power prices spiking, an automatic set of rules turns on, substitution rights expand, carryover releases schedule, tiered surcharges adjust, shutoff protections strengthen, and emergency grants open to smaller districts. Hardwire mercy and flexibility into the moment scarcity arrives. These levers won't make it rain. They make contracts behave like they remember what water is for. When that's true, a dry year hurts without breaking people or their city's balance sheet. Personal risk map. Protect your household and portfolio. Start with your bill and your bonds. Check who owns your utility, variable rate exposure, DSCR trends, and any pending rate cases. Read May. Look for swap liabilities, take or pay, no substitution, carryover dependencies. Homebuyers. Ask basin status, adjudication history, special districts, and liened assessments. Portfolio. Scan muni funds for privatized utility weight, drought beta, and call schedules. Small businesses, secure backup storage, review force majeure and price adjustment clauses. Households, lifeline applications, leak audits, shutoff protections. Then show up, demand contract disclosure and substitution rights. Return to the street, Microchoices, macro consequences. We're back on the cul-de-sac that got the 48-hour notice. The HOA chat is quieter now. Panic burned off into spreadsheets and hosed timers. People started making small moves that, together, changed the leverage at City Hall. First, lawns. A neighbor who once treated grass like a personality trait took the rebate to tear it out. He didn't post a victory lap. He posted his water bill before and after. Others followed because the savings were a receipt, not a sermon. Within weeks, the HOA board, which had fined people for yellow patches, rewrote its bylaws to allow native plantings and ban daytime sprinklers. One rule vanished. No more uniform green aesthetic. It turned into no irrigation runoff. The board also did something braver. It asked the city to verify leak rates on the mains serving their block. A month later, crews replaced a weeping joint that had quietly poured their conservation efforts into the street. City Hall finally opened the drawer. Contracts went online. Redactions, yes, but enough to see the bones. The public learned which clauses could bite, and when. That shifted the next negotiation. When a supplier floated a no-substitution rider, staff could point to a packed council chamber and say, "We won't survive that hearing." The leverage wasn't a stern letter. It was the knowledge that the neighborhood now knew what sole remedy meant and would show up with copies. Transparency didn't lower the river. It lowered the temperature on rumor long enough for staff to get better terms. Farmers in the basin caught the signal. A cooperative of orchardists offered a test: deficit irrigation for a heat spell, paired with a city payment that arrived fast, days, not months. The trees would survive, yields would dip, the city would avoid buying peak-price water. The deal included a twist. If the city didn't need the freed gallons, the coup got them back in a fall pulse to help trees set for next season. No one loved it. Everyone lived with it. After, the coup's WhatsApp lit with photos of moisture probes and brittle leaves that didn't turn to dead limbs. The city's dashboard recorded fewer emergency truck rolls. The bond desk noticed coverage didn't wobble. It was small, but it worked. The utility, under an oversight committee that now included a nurse, a teacher, a line worker, and a hydrologist, flipped its rate design without waiting for a perfect model. Lifeline first. The first block of use cheap enough that shut-off notices lost their teeth for families using water to live, not to decorate. Then steep steps that made sprinklers feel like a luxury, because they are. The committee also approved a drought luxury surcharge that applied automatically to usage above a set threshold during alerts. The first month, the high-end bills funded 2 new leak crews and a stockpile of gaskets that used to be next quarter's purchase. Microchoices multiplied. A restaurant stopped offering water by default, saved on dishes, and posted their monthly usage drop on Instagram. It wasn't sanctimony, it was content people copied. A strip mall swapped asphalt for a small bioswale that captured stormwater into a cistern for landscape use. It cost less than the owner's last marketing campaign and did more to cut their bill than any coupon. A church opened its commercial kitchen taps on Saturdays so neighbors with shut-off anxiety could fill containers. No questions, no clipboard, just a sign that said water. Meanwhile, the city's procurement team, now with a preference for transparency baked into scoring, rejected a desal proposal that looked shiny and landed like a mortgage. They said yes to a smaller recycled water project with a clause that shared refinancing gains with ratepayers and capped energy pass-throughs. They also signed for emergency interties with 2 neighbors, each with substitution rights that snapped on when the system crossed threshold alarms. The alarms were public. So were the drill dates. People stopped wondering what Plan B was because they could watch it being tested. There was a moment that felt like a turning point, though nobody called it that at the time. A kid at the end of the block asked why the park's grass was still green when everyone else's was beige. The park's director came to a community night with a simple answer. Fields were on recycled water, not the same water from your kitchen. He brought a map showing where purple pipe lines ran and where they'd expand next, funded by the luxury surcharge. The kid nodded. The parents nodded. That tiny whiteboard beat a dozen press releases. Trust returned in increments, like a leaky pipe fixed one clamp at a time. The dark humor didn't disappear. A neighbor taped a handwritten sign to his host's spigot. In case of emergency, this turns money into mud. But the jokes drifted from doom to relief. People could see the city's leak rate falling on a live dashboard. They could see carryover balances and release schedules. They could see when a clause would bite and what the alternative would cost. The fights didn't vanish. They got more honest. At the next budget hearing, the treasurer didn't bring a panic memo. She brought a laddered debt plan that trimmed variable rate exposure and a cash reserve policy that funded itself with drought surcharge revenue and shut off when reservoirs were healthy. The rating analyst, on the phone this time, used the word stability out loud. In the back row, the mother who'd once stood outside at midnight with a shut-off notice pressed in her palm asked a question nobody expected. What can we do at home that helps your DSCR so you don't have to raise rates next time? The treasurer laughed once, the tired kind, and said, fix leaks. Use the lifeline. Show up. Policy rippled outward. The city passed a local rule that banned rigid no substitution and required sellers to disclose carryover balances to qualify for public contracts. The Basin Watermaster added an emergency release protocol that prioritized hospitals, schools, and staple crops, with compensation funded by a temporary levy on scarcity-priced trades. It wasn't war. It was the slow, civic work of remembering water is a shared trust that money rents but doesn't own. In the neighborhood, the new native plantings brought bees. A kid selling popsicles switched to a cooler with a sign, made with tap water and honesty. The HOA newsletter ran a column by the utility line worker on how to spot a main leak by sound at night. The Microchoices didn't solve climate or erase covenants. They changed who sits at the table when the next clause tries to bite. It's not a movie ending. It's a meeting schedule. But if you want to see how macro finance meets your faucet, this is it. Neighbors ripping lawns for rebates, a council refusing shiny mortgages, farmers getting paid to stress trees instead of families, a treasurer who sleeps sometimes, and contracts that finally read like they remember what water is for. Control of pumping rights decides bills, food prices, and whether cities stay solvent when a dry month turns into a fiscal event. If you want more hard-nosed playbooks for beating the infrastructure debt trap, subscribe and share this with someone on your city council. Then watch our next episode. It breaks down the infrastructure financing tricks that quietly raise your bill even when nothing gets fixed.